Hey there. This video is a voiceover of the Emily Blunt sketching time-lapse that I have posted on YouTube. The goal with this particular class/voiceover is to explain to you everything that is going through my mind as I sketch out a likeness within Blender. We're going to talk about things like proportions, reading the silhouette. We are going to talk about things like camera settings, which if you are coming from ZBrush, the camera is actually very different because in Blender we have a true 3D camera. So when we're dealing with things like field of view, we're not necessarily approaching it exactly the same way as we would approach field of view within ZBrush. And we're going to break that down later. We're going to talk about references and how to read references effectively. What is it within those references that we are looking for? And then what is it about those references that we afterward want to apply on our 3D models? I'll share a few tips and tricks as to how to read references effectively. And I'll also share why is it that getting your own references off of Google image search may be one of the worst things that you can do for yourself if you are trying to sculpt a likeness. A lot of the notions that we'll talk about actually extend very well to also doing likeness sculpting within ZBrush. So even if you're not necessarily a Blender user, but you are a ZBrush user, you'll probably still find that there is a lot within this particular class that is very relevant to you. Because the sculpting process really is the same in whichever software that you are. So once you've gotten the technical side of the software out of the way, then the sculpting process is pretty much the same. My ultimate goal for this class is to really bring you within my own mentality when I do likeness sculpting. What are the things that I think about? What are the things that are less important, but that people think that are actually important? So my goal is to really bring you within that moment of sculpting and to share my thought process in the hopes that that influences your own thought process when it comes to doing likeness sculpting. Beyond the idea of watching videos like these, the most important thing that you need to do if you want to become a better sculptor is to practice. And practice every day, even if it's only for a few minutes, even if you have only 15 to 30 minutes every day, practicing your hand, practicing your eye on a daily basis will keep your skills sharp and will help you improve. Always important to practice on a regular basis, daily if possible, even if it's only for a few minutes every day. One thing I want to mention before we do start the video is that we are going to start with a cube that has already been remeshed so that the topology is somewhat high res, and we can just get started with the clay strips brush. This is something that we've talked about within the previous class, so we won't go through that here again. But ultimately, the remesh resolution really doesn't matter that much. Just set something that seems somewhat comfortable for you. You don't want it to be so low res that you cannot see any of the brushstrokes that you are doing. And you also don't want it to be so high res that you are wasting performance. Beyond that, it's really just a question of personal preference. And if you feel that you don't even have a preference yourself as far as the kind of remesh resolution that you need to start with, it just means that you need more practice. By sculpting a few heads within Blender, at some point you'll just start to have a pretty good feeling for the kind of remesh resolution that you like to set at the beginning. But as we have said in the previous class here on Blender on Algang, it really doesn't matter that much what is the remesh resolution. What really matters is thinking about volumes and really thinking about things like planes, proportions, silhouette. All of those are the things that matter when we are sculpting a head. And questions like, okay, what is the exact remesh resolution that I should be at? Those are technical questions that are best left for later. The thing that we want to do at the beginning is to really get the interface of the software out of the way as soon as we can so that we can let ourselves get absorbed by the sculpting process. If you can't get the likeness down, then why waste time trying to get the technical side of things down? A technically well-realized head whose likeness simply isn't well captured really won't bring you any points online at all. Whereas a head that is artistically pleasant and where the likeness has been well captured, even if the technical side of things is a little bit sloppy, people will still be impressed by your work. Now, of course, I'm not saying that you should never worry about the technical side of things. If you're doing a portfolio piece because you want to apply for a job somewhere, you definitely need to flex your technical strength. But when it comes to sketching things, we're simply not at the phase where those kind of questions matter. So my cube has been already remeshed, and on top of that, I have also scaled the cube so that it is 15 centimeters across on all axes. Doing that will help me later on to make sure that my head has proper measurements, because we will be using some of the measurement tools within Blender to make sure that our head is at the proper scale. And if you're not familiar with what anthropometry is, we have a class here on the website that spells out what that is and how you can leverage that to create better heads. It's an underappreciated notion that is so important when it comes to creating heads and to make sure that our heads are at the proper scale and have proper proportions. So go and check out the anthropometry lecture after you've done with this one if you haven't done so already. All right, let's do some Blender sculpting. When I start sculpting, it doesn't matter if I start from a cube, if I start from a sphere. The thing that I want at the beginning is to try to get the primary planes of the face down. Now, if you haven't done any kind of artistic study, maybe, the notion of primary planes, secondary planes, tertiary planes may not be something that you are familiar with. But I kind of like to think about everything that I sculpt in terms of 3 levels of detail, really. And the primary planes, for me, they're really the most important volumes of the face. If you imagine just zooming out, what you will see will be only the primary volumes of the face. So they're really what are the most major, the biggest volumes that you have over a face. It's actually kind of hard to train our eye to spot the primary planes of a head in the beginning, because especially when we look at references, we have a tendency to start to zoom in within those references. And we tend to focus on the sharper details, the sharper volumes. If we take a look at the nose here, we have a tendency to think a lot about, let's say, the wings of the nostrils here or the ball here that is at the tip of the nose here. But we don't necessarily think that much about the shape of the nose in an extremely simplified way. And so those are what the primary planes are. Of course, everyone has different primary planes, but it's a great thing to start with to try to really define those, to really look at our references, try to judge, okay, where are the primary planes? What are their shape? What are their size? What is their proportions in relation to each other? And the more that you sculpt heads, you'll find that those primary planes always come back. You obviously have variations across different people, but in general, those primary planes all seem to come back on a regular basis, because ultimately there really isn't that many of them, and there's really only so many ways that we can shape a human head, really. And if you train yourself to try to really spot where the primary planes are on the face, the more that you train your eye to be able to spot those, the better you're going to get at those, and the easier of a time that you're going to have to define those primary planes on a head. Secondary volumes or secondary planes now are things that have a bit more of an anatomical meaning to them. So we were talking about the nose here, we were talking about the wings of the nose, we were talking about the cartilage here that is on the tip of the nose. Those smaller anatomical details, those smaller anatomical volumes are what, for me, falls within the notion of secondary planes, secondary volumes, or secondary details. You'll see that as I talk, I have a tendency to use those terms interchangeably, either secondary planes, volumes, or details, because for me, they're all kind of more or less the same thing. We can technically separate those and give a bit of a different definition to all of those, but for the most part, it's not always all that important. As long as we talk about primary detail, secondary detail, and tertiary details, and we know what we are referencing, roughly speaking, then we have all the knowledge that we need. We have the awareness that we need to be able to start to pay attention to those. As I'm sculpting, I keep my references on a second screen, and I'm just constantly looking at different references. I'll have a tendency to do what I'm doing here, which is I'm going to go around my PureRef board. I'm going to zoom into different images. I'm going to look, let's say right now we're looking at the profile, we're looking at the mouth. I'll have a tendency to just find a profile in there or a 3/4, go in there, take a look at what the head looks like from that particular angle. And I'm going to spend some time to sculpt something from that particular angle, but I don't want to get within tunnel vision mode. And what I mean by that is you get tunnel vision when you start to focus on the same reference, on the same body part, on the same angle for way too long. In fact, if you take a look at how I am sculpting, I'm constantly dancing around, right now I'm sculpting a little bit of the chin, and now I'm suddenly just moving around here to sculpt a little bit of the jaw. And I'm just trying to improve everything all at once. I'm trying to not get stuck on a little detail or a particular angle somewhere. Because you may find if you do that you're able to get either the detail or that particular angle to look pretty good. And the moment that you rotate your camera around or you start to look at that detail in the context of everything else that you have created, you start to see that somehow it really doesn't work all that great. And that happens because you've had that tunnel vision over that particular detail or trying to capture a particular angle for way too long. It's much better to just dance around the shape, work a little bit here. Right now we're working on the nostrils a little bit. Now I'm going back down to the mouth and I'm going back down to the chin afterward and the jaw, as you can see. So I'm just constantly just dancing around the shape. My brain is kind of always constantly trying to find what is the biggest difference that I can spot between my 3D model right now and a particular reference that I have focused on at that particular moment here. I'm just constantly just moving my eyes around, taking a look at the 3D model that I have, trying to find, okay, let me just pause here for just a second here. In fact, let me just go back here. I'm just constantly trying to just dance around and just try to find, okay, where are the biggest differences? Or what is the biggest difference that I can spot at that particular moment between my reference and my 3D sculpt? And whatever is that particular point that I'm looking at and that I feel that is something that I can address, I'm going to go in, I'm going to try to get that particular detail, that particular part of the face to be just slightly closer to my references, but I'm not going to try to match my reference 100%, because if you do that, you're going to get down the rabbit hole and you're going to get lost in trying to get everything down perfectly. And you really don't want to do that at the beginning. You want to be constantly dancing around the shape. Tweak the lips here a little bit. Once the lips are a bit closer to your references, then how you have shaped those lips will influence how you are reading everything else over the face or everything else that is around the lips. So then do a little bit of work until you feel as if you've gotten the lips to be closer to your references, but not trying to match them 100%. And once you feel that you have made meaningful progress, then move on to other things that are around those lips, because you're going to find that the changes that you have done to the lips themselves will start to influence how you are reading the nose or the proportions of the nose or the proportions of the jaw or the cheek, these sorts of things. And you just want to constantly and very gradually build and always get slightly closer to your references. In this particular case, you can see that I'm using the clay strips brush, and I've roughly made the size of the clay strips brush to be the size of the neck. And I'm just doing one brush stroke here, and I'm just doing little circles to pull the neck out. Let me just go back here and let's look at that again. You can see how it looks. Very, very simple. There's obviously a lot of different ways that you can grow a neck. You could mask it and pull it out. You could append a cylinder to there and you could weld that to your head. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but I like to use the clay strips in this particular case because it is simply very easy. I don't have to break my flow to be able to add the neck. If I start to have to add a separate cylinder in there and then try to boolean it together, that works. And if you feel comfortable doing that, then I think that that's great. But I like to always, as much as possible, stay within that flow as much as I can. And if I have to do something that is very technically perhaps challenging or that takes a lot of little steps, then that's going to break me out of my flow state. And that may actually be detrimental in the long term. So I'm constantly always looking for what is the, if I could put it this way, the low technology approach that I can use to reach a particular result, a particular volume that I'm looking for. Of course, later on, we are going to append separate meshes for the eyes, but even for the shape of the eyelids, you'll see later on that I'm just going to go in there and I'm just going to sculpt them really. Because once again, we could create those eyelids using different methods. We could append half spheres and we could do a whole lot of stuff like that that's very technically more involved perhaps. But when I do that, that breaks me out of my flow state. And at this point, the only thing I want to be doing, I just want to sculpt, you know? And the better you get at sculpting, the better you're going to get at creating these more complex shapes, these more complex results, perhaps, with some very basic, some very low technology tools like the clay strips brush. And so practicing sculpting will make you better at sculpting, believe it or not, which means that you will be relying less and less on other methods to create whatever kind of volume, whatever kind of result that you are trying to do here. Once again, for the ears here, we could also do that, right? We could append something here to start to create the ear. We could mask the ear. We could pull it out. And I'm not saying that those techniques are bad necessarily, but there is certainly a point where you become so good using those basic brushes of Blender that you don't even feel the need to use any other technique. You're just going to look at your clay strips brush and you're going to say, hey, I already have everything I need. Let me just go in here, create a few brush strokes, and there you go. I have a base for my ear here. So even if things may look a little bit daunting, a little bit hard for you when it comes to sculpting them, practicing them will simply make you better at them and will make it easier for you to sculpt those things in the future. That should go without saying, of course. That's like training in anything, really. If you don't feel comfortable sculpting something, you could either look for a different technique to get the result that you want, or you could also simply practice sculpting even more. And eventually, everything that you feel that you struggle with creating with those basic sculpting brushes, you will feel confident that you can do them at some point in the future after you have practiced enough. The thing that I love about becoming better as a sculptor, as opposed to always looking for other tools that can help us create a particular shape, a particular result that we are looking for, is that at some point after you've put in the time and you've become good enough at sculpting, you'll be able to sculpt anything that people could actually throw at you. You'll be able to sculpt heads, hard surface stuff, cloth, creatures. It doesn't matter. You'll always feel in control. You'll always feel confident within your sculpting abilities because you know how to reach pretty much any result that you want. You are able to hit the volumes that you imagine using those basic brushes. So yeah, sculpting heads, practicing with those basic brushes not only makes you better at sculpting heads, but it also makes you better at sculpting hard surfaces, creatures, other types of surfaces and details, believe it or not. That's why I love to sculpt likenesses, even if nowadays we obviously have access to scans and we have access to a whole bunch of different things that we could use as a shortcut to help us create heads faster. And certainly within the context of production, I would definitely look to use those shortcuts for sure. But this is why I really love to still be practicing head sculpting nowadays, because I believe that head sculpting is one of the hardest things that we can sculpt, because we have a part of our brain that is so good at recognizing faces and likenesses. We have a supercomputer in our brain when it comes to spotting faces and reading faces, that we are really, really good at telling when something is off or not when it comes to sculpting something. So because we're fighting up against everyone's very good judgment of what a head actually looks like, it really forces us to be very, very precise with our sculpting, with our result, if we really want to have something that will impress people and that will look like it is well realized. So because of that supercomputer that we have within our brain when it comes to recognizing people's faces, I sincerely believe that sculpting heads is quite literally the hardest sculpting project that we could undertake. And if we become great at sculpting heads, we will be great at sculpting anything else that people could throw at us. So we've talked briefly about primary planes and secondary planes. You can see that I'm kind of slowly starting to get within secondary plane territory. You can see the nose, I'm starting to define it here a little bit more, these sorts of things. But I'm always looking to define, if I feel that there is a bigger volume, okay? Like I've talked about the fact that I want to be looking at my references and I want to be constantly asking myself the question, okay, what is the next move? What is the next thing that I can address? And let me just pause here because I don't want to start to talk about the eyes right away. I want to finish this thought first. I'm constantly always looking for what is the next move. What is the next most important difference, perhaps, that I can personally spot between the 3D model that I'm working on and my references, of course. And the important thing here to mention is that right now we're going to start to sculpt the eyes here a little bit, but you can see that I've actually waited quite a lot before I even started to define those eyes, because when I am spotting or trying to spot those differences between the 3D model and my references, the thing that I haven't mentioned so far that is a very important thing to mention, okay? In fact, let me just go back here and let's rewatch a few minutes of these while I talk about this here. I'm always looking for what is the biggest volume that I need to address. And what I mean by that is, if I feel as if the size of the cranium isn't there, okay, and some of those references make it quite hard. This one's not too bad. We can kind of see what is the shape of the cranium here because we can see the full head here. I'm always looking for the bigger differences, meaning that if the size of the cranium isn't there, okay, if I feel as if the size of the cranium isn't quite there when I look at my 3D model compared to my references, in no way do I want to let myself get absorbed by smaller details in that. Always work from the bigger details, the bigger volumes, down to the smaller volumes. In fact, that whole idea of primary, secondary, and tertiary details almost don't even matter in a way if you are always in that mentality of working from bigger to smaller. If you think about primary, secondary, and tertiary details, it's really just another way to say work from the bigger details down to the smaller details. And if you're actually quite good at doing that instinctively or intuitively, you're always looking for the bigger volumes that need to be addressed and you're addressing those first, then even the notion of what is primary, secondary, and tertiary details or thinking about your head in that context doesn't even matter, because naturally you will be brought and you will be tempted to make sure that the size of the skull is down and the size, let's say, of the front of the jaw here and the front of the face and what we call the mask of the face here. Make sure that all of those shapes, all of those volumes are roughly what they need to be before you even start to worry about things like eyes and inside of the ear here or other things. If you're always thinking in terms of bigger volume and always addressing the biggest volume that you can find and bringing it closer to your references, then you're going to be in a great position. And it also means that things like defining eyes, defining the wings of the nostrils, defining the inside of the nostrils, these sorts of things, you're going to leave those for later. You're not even going to worry about those until you get to the point where those are the bigger divergences that you can spot between your 3D model and your references, of course. But I still think that there's a lot of value in thinking about things in terms of primary details, secondary details, and tertiary details, which we haven't mentioned what tertiary details are, by the way. Tertiary details, I like to think about them as simply what are the surface details, which for me include things like skin pores and fine wrinkles, but could also be extended to much, much smaller kind of volumes that you have over a face. I really think about the primary planes as what is given to us, the kind of volumes that we get from the bony structure of a head. The secondary details, the secondary planes, what brings the anatomical credibility to our face. So the anatomical details, if you will, are what is more within the secondary detail range, if you will. And then the tertiary details, as we said, is just pretty much anything that is smaller than that. Anything that from a distance from here, you probably wouldn't even be able to really tell. Those are the details that fall within the tertiary detail category. And you can definitely imagine that there is absolutely a hierarchy of importance between primary, secondary, and tertiary details, of course. As we have said, the primary volumes, the bigger volumes, are always more important. If your head is not proportioned properly, then no matter of adding smaller details on top of it will make it look good. If people look at your head and they feel as if the size of the skull isn't the size that it needs to be, it's too big, it's too small, if your eyes are too big, if your eyes are too small, then it doesn't matter what kind of details you're going to add on top of it. It's never going to look good. That's why you always want to address the bigger volumes first. And I don't care that you're working on smaller things. Let's say you're working on the eyes, you're working on the mouth. If you spot a major difference in terms of the primary planes, the primary volumes of the head, go and attack that. Leave whatever it is that you are doing on the side. Put that aside. You can come back on it later. Go and always address those bigger details first. Now, it doesn't mean either that we have to be 100% there with all those details, because especially when we are doing likenesses, okay, you're going to be sculpting for a while and you're going to get within the wilderness of details at some point, and of anatomical details. And you're going to start to move things by like a millimeter left and a millimeter right and a millimeter forward. And you're going to spend quite a lot of time later on to really fine tune the likeness so that it is 100% there. And you will see that getting to 80% in terms of likeness will be much, much faster than that last 20%. And in fact, you will be spending 20% of your time to get up to 80% in terms of likeness. And you will be spending 80% of your time to get that last 10, 15, or 20% that is left afterward to really get that likeness down. So your goal at this stage, since you are at the sketching stage, is not to get to 100%, but to get to about 80%. That's the good enough point that you want to be. But the same thing applies for the eyes, okay? I'm not trying to get the eyes to be ultra detailed. You can see here, I've just made eyes that are closed because it allows me to capture the volume of the eyelids without at this point having to worry about actually getting the eyeballs in there. Because if we get the eyeballs in there too quickly and the rest of our face isn't close enough, it's really going to throw us completely off in terms of how we're going to read the face. So here again, we want to define the overall volume that the eyelids create. We want to define that first because that is a bigger volume, if you will, than defining the minute details involved in creating the actual opening to the eyes, or what we call the palpebral fissure there. So one thing at a time, always go from bigger to smaller. Let's talk a little bit about references here, and of course we'll come back on talking about the sculpt later on, but I just want to mention where I got these references, okay? So all these references are taken from Netflix. There's no references in here that are taken from Google image search. It's fine to have a few of those within your library of references, but as much as possible, when I am creating a likeness, I want to select a moment in time where I can get a very nice degree of consistency in the morphology of someone's face. If you're just grabbing your images off of Google search, what will likely happen is that you're going to get different ages of your celebrity that you are starting to sculpt on. Of course, you don't have to sculpt celebrities all of the time, but it is definitely the best place to start, okay? Because the quality of your references matter for creating a proper head there. So if you're trying to practice likeness sculpting, but you're doing that using someone that is somewhat obscure as a person, or perhaps you're doing a historical figure for which you really can't get that much data in terms of references, then that's obviously going to limit your ability to create a proper likeness there. So working on likenesses of people who are perhaps more obscure, quote unquote, is better left for when you have successfully sculpted a few likenesses and you want to challenge yourself further. If you're just starting off, my advice is start from a celebrity of some kind, someone from which you can get a lot of images, a lot of references easily. And of that, actors and actresses really definitely are the better people because you have access to movies and you have access to TV shows where they are in. So I source my references from movies and TV shows. And the reason why I do that is really twofold. One is that it gives me consistency in terms of age, in terms of morphology, when looking at someone's face. If we are getting our references off of Google image search, you will get references of someone when they were at different ages, when they were doing different movies, perhaps, and perhaps they have even changed their bodies. Maybe they have gained weight, maybe they have lost weight, and that's really just going to throw you completely off. You won't really be able to really find the commonality between all of those references there. It's going to make it much harder for you to do so. When you get all your references from a single movie or a few movies that are close in time or a few TV show episodes, you're making sure that your reference will always more or less look the same. And it's just going to bring a lot more consistency, and it's going to make it a lot easier for you to be able to read your references properly. And the second reason why I get my references from movies and TV shows is because getting your references from movies and TV shows will get you a lot more angles that will allow you to spot a lot of things that you wouldn't be able to spot otherwise if all you're doing is looking at Google image search. In fact, most of the images that you get off of Google image search are images taken from straight on and sometimes with a flash, and you get like this kind of really terrible lighting, or the lighting is just very diffuse and the lighting just doesn't cut any volumes. It really doesn't allow you to read any volumes properly because the lighting is completely flat. And so you're just not seeing any of those beautiful volumes just pop out like we can see, let's say, on this particular reference here. So when you get your references from movies and TV shows, you are also getting a lot more angles on the faces that you want to sculpt that will in turn help you to sculpt a better face, right? Like this particular angle here, okay? It may not look like much because she's actually facing away from the camera, but it gives us a lot of really, really useful information as to the shape of the jaw, the size of the jaw, the depth of the jaw. And it also allows us to read the silhouette from this particular angle so we can put our own 3D model within the same angle as this reference and see if the silhouette matches or not. So those angles, you won't be able to find those easily off of Google image search. Let's say this one here too. That's a beautiful one because the camera is slightly lower than her head. And so we can actually appreciate, let's say, the exact shape of her nostrils here. We can appreciate what is the depth here of the eyes in relation to the frontal bone here of the skull. So we can actually appreciate a lot more of some of the depth of some of those details over the face. If we compare these two references here, we can't actually see what is the depth here, let's say, of her eyes in relation to the brow bone. We can't really appreciate easily what is the size of the nostrils there. And a 3/4 image won't really give us that either, and neither will a profile. But with a shot like this, where the camera is slightly lower than her head and we're looking up at her head, we can appreciate a lot better what is the size of the things like the nostrils. So all of those angles here, all of those exotic angles are actually very, very valuable for us when it comes to sculpting. And then we also have lighting that is a lot more contrasted, as you can see. We get lighting that really cuts and really shapes the volumes of the face. We can read the volumes of the face a lot better because the lighting is more contrasted, and sometimes our faces are even lit from only one major light source, as in this particular image that is right here. Because that's all we're doing really when we are sculpting faces. We are reading references. We are reading volumes on our reference. We're looking for the different volumes of the face, and then our job afterward is to go within 3D and to replicate those volumes. So if we can't read volumes properly on our references, then we won't be able to sculpt our head afterward because we won't have any information to go off of. So that's why I prefer to get my references from movies and from TV shows. It takes more time to do so, of course, than to just grab a few random images off of Google search, because you have to either watch a movie, watch a TV show, you have to find the proper angles, you have to take the screenshot, then afterward you have to combine all that within a pure ref board, as you can see here. It takes more time, it's more involved, it's less impulsive perhaps, but this is preparation that will pay dividends for you in the long term. And if you are serious about sculpting someone's likeness because you want to make a portfolio piece or something, then spending a few hours to really make sure that you are getting very, very high quality references will really help you to create a much, much better sculpt. You can see here the kind of work that I'm doing here. So I'm putting my camera within the same angle as we have on this particular reference, and I'm just looking for things like depth here. What is the depth of the brow bone? What is the depth of the eyes? What is the shape of the nostrils here compared to my reference here? And if I didn't have this particular reference, I wouldn't be able to do that. We can also spot things here that were not easier to spot in other angles here. Let's say, if we look at, let's say, the shape of the lips here, you can see how different the lips are on my 3D model versus what is on the reference here. You can see how different these are here. So once again, this is a lot of very, very useful information for us. You can see here that I'm actually playing with the light. Now, this is something that I have to explore a little bit more. It's great to obviously switch your lighting around when you are sculpting because it there too simply allows you to read the volumes of your face in a slightly different way. But ultimately, I haven't explored enough the different lighting types within the Blender viewport. But I do intend to do that at some point, so that will go within a future class where I will be able to talk about that. When I am sculpting though, okay, one thing that I do want to mention is that I am trying to put a little bit of my anatomical knowledge aside because what I'm trying to do is always read volumes, read planes. And let me just pause this for just a second here. Because if you're not used to doing things like trying to spot planes or read planes on reference, maybe this is something that you haven't really done before, that you haven't really trained yourself to do, okay? But when we look at references, what we are trying to do, okay? Oh, look at this particular angle, by the way. This is beautiful, this particular angle here, because we can really see the silhouette here of the face. We can really appreciate how wide the cheekbones are, especially in relation to the jaw here. We can really see some beautiful relationship here that really aren't all that easy to see within any other references, really. But so the notion of plane, okay, this is an important notion. And if you haven't really pondered the question or really been exposed to that notion before, this is actually very, very important, okay? When I'm reading references, when I'm trying to sculpt, let's say that we take this particular image here, okay? Planes are one of the most important things for you to try to focus on, okay? So we have volumes, of course, but the thing about volumes is that in an anatomical context, that volumes are rarely spherical. Volumes on a face are created because there is something under the skin that is pushing up against the skin, and the skin certainly has an influence on top of that. And so when you have a volume somewhere, there's a bump somewhere in someone's face. Let's say that we look at the nose. In fact, the nose is one of the best examples of that, okay? We could think of the tip of the nose as a ball or as something that is very spherical. And in terms of simplification, that is absolutely true. But what really brings anatomical credibility to a nose, to the tip of the nose, is that when we start to pay attention to and we start to really spot where are the different places over that spherical volume that is a bit flatter or perhaps a bit curvier or that has a slightly different shape or that is perhaps a little bit oval, these sorts of things. So this is what light gives us. When light reacts with a surface, it allows us to see, by looking at the shading, it allows us to see what are the zones that are a little bit flatter, a little bit rounder, and to really judge what is the angle of things and where are the planes, let's say, on a particular head. Not everything is completely planar, of course. We do have parts of a head, parts of a body that is curvy. But in general, one of the best things that you can do, especially if you're starting off, is to really try to practice yourself to spot the flatter planes of a head. And if we take a look at the nose, okay, a nose isn't a completely spherical. The tip of the nose isn't something that is completely spherical because we have these little planes that are here, these little flatter planes that you can kind of tell. In fact, if I zoom in on this more, this is probably not going to help. It's actually better sometimes to zoom out because from there we'll be able to sometimes spot a little bit more the planes over a face here. But you can kind of see here as I move my cursor here, there's a little bit of a difference here in shading. It's like as if the shading here, the shadow that is under the nose, is somewhat of the same color here. And when you see that, that's a very clear sign that everything that has the same kind of shading value is a place over the face, a place over your reference that all points in the same direction, essentially what is a plane. We have a little bit of a shadow here. There's a bit of a sharp line, okay? You can see how the light seems to kind of change somewhat gradually over the ball of the nose here. We have a little bit of a highlight here, and there's this kind of somewhat gradual, kind of soft lighting transition here where we go from where is the highlight here to a zone here that is a little bit more within the shadow here. As I run my cursor horizontally, the lighting changes in a very gradual way. But as I move my cursor diagonally, you can see that there is definitely a place here where the shading changes a little bit more abruptly, where we go from a zone here that is not necessarily highlight, but is certainly lit, to a place under the nose that is unlit, or that is within shadow here, or within a bit of a penumbra, perhaps. So when we are looking at references, we are hunting for those. We're hunting for those flatter zones over a head. You can see there's a beautiful plane here that is getting created here. So not everything is planes, of course, but there are a lot of zones of a face that is somewhat planar. And so our job, our challenge is to read the volumes, the way that the light shapes the volumes over our reference, which once again is why we need references that have contrasted lighting, or that have lighting coming from the least amount of sources as much as possible. If you have lighting coming from every direction at once, as is often the case if you get your references off of Google image search, you won't be able to read the volumes properly. You won't be able to read the planes, spot the planes, read the shading over the face there. But in this particular case, because the lighting here is coming from pretty much only one direction, or we have at least one major key light in this particular case, it makes it so that here too, on the sides of the temples here, we can see how the shading rather over the face is all of the same exact value here. And so that's the telltale sign that there is a planar part on the side of the head here. And we can even spot where the lighting changes somewhat abruptly here. So once again, if we take a look at the forehead here, we have a highlight here. From the highlight, we have a very curvy, very gradual change in shading until we reach the temporal line, and then we have a abrupt change in shading. And once we get to the temporal zone of the face, then we have what is the same shading value over the temporal zone. So that's what you want to be reading when you look at references. You want to train your eye to be able to read the volumes. And then afterward, of course, your job is to afterward go on the 3D model and then obviously sculpt those volumes the way that you are seeing them. But when I started talking about this, I had mentioned anatomical knowledge here. And one thing that I have found out was that although I do know my anatomy very well, and I highly suggest that you learn anatomy, that you learn everything that you can, that you study every source of anatomical knowledge for faces that you can get your hands on, the fact still remains that you also kind of want to put that aside a little bit, because when you are at that sketching stage, the only thing you want to do is to read the volumes, read the shading over your references, and try to match that. If you see a sharp line somewhere, you want to sculpt the sharp line, and you don't want to worry too much about that being the temporal line or temporal fossa, and then start to worry too much about the exact anatomical details. Because you can kind of see that in people who overly study anatomy but don't actually practice enough their own artistic eye. They create sculpts, and I think this is more visible when it comes to bodies actually. They will create sculpts where the full body, you can tell that every muscle is where it needs to be. So anatomically speaking, it is correct, but in terms of volumes, in terms of the shape of the surface, they're completely off. Either everything is a little bit too sharp, they've overly defined the separation between the muscles, so it kind of looks like someone who doesn't have any skin. It looks like an écorché. Or the volumes are wrong. The placement of the muscles is proper, but the volumes of those muscles is completely off. You can kind of see that in people who overly focus on anatomy and don't focus enough on simply training their artistic eye to be able to look at their references and be able to copy what it is that they are seeing. Because I'm actually convinced that someone who has a perfect artistic eye doesn't actually even need to know anatomy, because technically everything that you need is already there in terms of information. You don't technically need to know your anatomy to be able to sculpt the face. You just, in a way, need to be able to read the volumes that are in front of you. You need to be able to read and properly interpret how the light reacts with the surface. So ultimately, you don't even need anatomy training in a way to be able to properly sculpt something. But I personally think that it is absolutely beneficial, because it helps you to simply understand the volumes that you are looking for, or rather that you are looking at. And of course, you have to piece together, when you're creating a likeness, you have to piece together a lot of different references that all kind of give you different clues as to what is the shape of the surface at any one location there. So knowing anatomy does help you to kind of figure out where it is that you are over a head. It does help you to create better heads for sure, but don't overly focus on that to the detriment of training your own artistic eye and your own observational skills. We've talked about light and trying to read what are the flatter zones of a face, read the planes, right? We can actually see there's a bit of a plane here. We can also see what is the angle of that plane a little bit in relation to the rest of the face. But there are more things that we are trying to look at, of course. In fact, let me just take a screenshot of this and let's go within Photoshop. Let's do a little bit of Photoshop and we'll come back to the sculpt afterward because this is important. And so what I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to mentally imagine what is the geometric representation of a face. And the moment that you have a zone of the face that all more or less has the same value within a reference, then it's not guaranteed that that is completely planar, but there's a pretty good chance that that is completely planar. If we take a look here at the underside of the brow bone, if you will, I can actually kind of draw a bit of a simplified trapezius here that kind of more or less goes towards the corners here of the eyes. You can kind of tell if I turn this off here how everything here kind of seems to be somewhat planar. It seems to all kind of be more or less flat here. Look at what my reference is kind of giving me right here. So there seems to be also a bit of a plane here, right? Because we can kind of see the lighting here, how the lighting kind of seems to be somewhat consistent. And other references will also sort of corroborate that there is a bit of a planar zone here. One thing that we also want to be doing in this particular stage is to also be thinking in terms of angles, okay? Like if you imagine this as a 3D volume, and we have one plane here and one plane there, then the question is also, the interesting question is also, what is the angle between those two planes? Can we more or less figure that out just by looking at it? Can we sort of estimate that by looking at it? What is the angle between those two planes? Because if we're able to imagine what is the angle there, if we're able to observe what is the angle between those two planes, then afterward, once we sculpt our 3D character, then we can also ask ourselves the question, do I have the proper angle here? You know? And so if we look at our reference, here it looks like it's more or less at 90 degrees, right? Perhaps not exactly, but pretty close to that. At least it's a very good simplification here. So I want to make sure that I also have something here that is at 90 degrees. This is also something that I am paying attention to. When I'm looking at my references, I'm always kind of trying to observe the relationship between some of the planes, the kind of angles that are between some of those planes, and then I try to afterward look at my 3D model and make sure that I'm kind of there as well. And then another thing that we want to look at is to try to judge what is the relationship between different lines. What I mean by that, okay, is that we have a few lines here that seem to be appearing, some somewhat sharp lines that are appearing here on this particular reference. And I'm thinking here about the tip of the nose, and I'm thinking here about the inside here of the nose. So we do have a plane that is right here. That is the side of the nose here. But I'm kind of looking for, okay, what is the angle, let's say, of this particular line in relation to the angle of this particular line? How are they sort of aligned in relation to each other? And you can kind of tell that they're kind of more or less the same, right? There's a very, very, very slight difference here in terms of angles, but we can certainly at this particular stage simplify them and say that they're pretty much more or less the same, right? So I'm kind of also kind of looking for differences in terms of angles. I'm looking for different relationships between different lines, different planes, these sorts of things. I'm just trying to spot relationships where I can see them. And then afterward, I try to make sure that I am capturing those relationships over my 3D model. So we want to be looking at the silhouette, of course. We do want to be looking at that. But beyond that, we want to be looking at planes, angles between planes, And also, when we see natural lines appear on one of our references, we want to also be studying the relationship between some of those lines. Perhaps even kind of draw it as this kind of very low res kind of representation of a character there. We can definitely do that. And this is just a process that I'm going through when I am looking at references. If it helps you to explicitly draw this out, okay, try to draw a kind of very low res representation of your face. It's a very good exercise to do. You obviously won't be able to complete the whole thing with only one reference, but just doing this once in a while is going to help you out to really just spot, once again, where are those major deviations or those major changes in terms of angles over a face. My surface is very sketchy because I'm really not at a point where I want to worry about surface definition. If our surface is very smooth, if we've taken the time to smooth out a lot of it, we may feel some hesitation at sculpting in a very rough way other volumes on top of that. If our surface is very smooth, but we are using a brush that is somewhat rough in this particular case, putting somewhat rough brushstroke over a very smooth surface is going to clash, visually speaking, and it's really going to affect our own confidence in the brushstrokes that we are doing. We won't want to continue to work on a particular surface. And then maybe we'll be like, well, instead of using a clay brush and trying to really sculpt those volumes, maybe I'm just going to use a move brush or a standard brush instead. And then we start to introduce other little artifacts because a move brush does create a little bit of artifacts. Sometimes it's not always perfect. All that will start to really influence in a very negative way how we are sculpting our head. So I like to keep everything very rough because it just makes it all look very sketchy, and it makes it so that I don't have to start to overly worry about surface definition at this particular stage. I'm starting to sculpt the eyes here. As you can see, I'm really just still with my remesh here. Of course, we'll have to remesh a few times. Control R as a shortcut, of course, as we're sculpting the inside of the eyes here. We've just done it once here, as you can see. But as you can see, I'm not actually doing anything fancy to sculpt the opening of the eyes here. I'm really just carving in the eye socket through the volume that I had previously created for the eyeball, for the closed eye. So I'm really just going here and just very, very slowly trying to sculpt the opening of the eye. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you just want to have a bit of a cavity in there. And also important is to make sure that you're sculpting a little bit of the inside of the eyelids. What do I mean by that? Well, as I'm sculpting, you can see that I'm pushing in a little bit on the inside of the eyelids here, because I want to get a little bit of that thickness in there to the actual eyelids. I don't want the cavity that I am creating to just extend perpendicularly inside from the border of the eyelids, because of course our lids, they are thin, of course, because we have our eyelids inside. And I want to represent that because for me, it actually makes a bit of a change to sculpt a little bit of the thickness of the eyelids. You don't have to go crazy on that, but just putting a few brushstrokes and trying to push in the inside of the eyelids a little bit, I just find that it makes it easier afterward to place the eyeballs and to shape the eyelids afterward. But beyond that, there's really nothing fancy about those particular eye sockets, as you can see. Now, this is one of those moments where the fact that we have our head at a proper scale becomes important, because I really don't like the guessing game of trying to guess how big an eyeball should be. We have access to very well documented measurements as to how big an actual human eyeball is. And because we're in a 3D context, it means that we can, every time that we sculpt the head, have eyes that are properly scaled. And the proper scale for an eyeball is between 24 to 27 millimeters across. That is the standard size of an eyeball. I want to leverage the fact that I'm working within a 3D software where we can have precise measurements to also create my eyeballs at the precise shape that they need to be. But of course, this only works if our head is also at the proper scale, which is why we have started with a cube that was 15 centimeters across, so that our skull, our base skull, is also at the proper scale. There's a full video on that topic. If you want to hear more about that, I suggest that you go and you watch that particular class on the website, the class on anthropometry, because it's a very, very important one. But so our skull is 15 centimeters across. That's how we have started it, which means that now by making our eyes about 24 millimeters across, then, or 24 to 26 millimeters. I do like to make them perhaps even about 25. I find that 24 sometimes is a little bit too small for me, but 25 to 26 millimeters across. If we make our eyeballs that particular size, and our cranium, our skull, is also of the proper scale, so it's about 15 centimeters across there, then we know that our eyes will simply wind up at the proper size for our head. And we don't have to guess whether our eyes are too big or too small. There are, of course, different measurements for females and for males. Of course, they don't have the exact same anthropometrical averages, if you will. For females, the average width of a head is about 14.5 centimeters, perhaps even a few millimeters under that. Whereas for male, the average head width, if you will be about 15 to 15.5 centimeters. And that is measured over the back of the skull here, as opposed to on the front, because that's also a pretty important question is, okay, so we know where the measurement, or rather how big the measurement should be, but where is it situated exactly? So that is also something that we can know by studying anthropometry. And for the width of the head, that would actually be at about this point here. If you take a look at me, so about here. So this is slightly further back than where the ears are. So what I'm doing here is that I'm using this particular measurement tool. You can see that I've gone out of sculpt mode and I am now in object mode, and I'm just using this particular measurement tool. Once you have it selected, you just have to hold down Control and do a click and drag to be able to see what is the exact measurement between 2 points. And so you can see that I'm measuring the size of the head here. We're at about 14.8 centimeters. For the size of the skull, measured slightly higher and slightly further back than the ears. It's a little bit too high. I probably want to shave off a few millimeters there to get closer to about 14.5, 14.2 in terms of head breadth, if you will, or the maximum width of the skull there. And my eyes are at about 5.6 centimeters right now. And that's a little bit too small, actually. I kind of want to have that distance to be a little bit higher there. I would actually like to be somewhere around 6.2. That is actually my goal. It's okay if I'm a little bit under that, but I want to make sure that I am respecting that the distance between the eyes as measured at the interpupillary distance, which is the distance between the center of the pupils, I want to be at about 6 to 6.2 centimeters or around that. I want to be within a normal human range. And once again, go and watch that class on anthropometry to hear more about that and what are the exact measurements that we want to hit and where you can get access to high quality anthropometrical measurements to help you create heads. You can also see how I have deviated the eyes slightly towards the outside. So my eyeballs are not looking straight ahead because there is something called angle kappa or kappa angle, however one you want to call it there, which is the fact that eyes are not actually pointing straight ahead. They're actually slightly rotated towards the outside because of the particular anatomy of the eyeballs. Since in the back of the eyeballs, we have both the optic nerve that is fighting for the space at the back of the eyeball with the fovea, point of the retina that has a higher concentration of nerve cells. They're both fighting for the space in the back of the eyeball. And therefore, for us to be able to look at something that is straight ahead of us and be able to have it within focus, our eyes actually need to be slightly deviated towards the outside, believe it or not. And which usually that deviation is between the order of 3 to 5 degrees for each eyeball. So I have a tendency to take my eyes, slightly rotate them towards the outside by just a few degrees, which in turn also influences that interpupillary distance, that anthropometrical measurement of the interpupillary distance. Because if we rotate the eyes slightly towards the outside, we are actually gaining a few millimeters between the two eyeballs if we measure the distance between the eyeballs at the center of the pupils. So that is also something that is kind of important there. And you can see that slight deviation that I'm talking about in this particular case. Of course, if you studied proportions in a relativistic sense, which is usually what you'll be doing if you are studying proportions in the context of drawing, let's say, because you can't just accurately measure things in that particular context, then you're probably used to the idea that you are supposed to be able to fit one eye between the two eyes here. So if we start from the corner of this eye here to the corner of this particular eye, we can neatly break this down into three sections that are more or less of the same width, I suppose. So you're supposed to fit about one eye in between the two eyes. But the important thing, though, to keep in mind there is that when we do talk about eye in this particular case, it's actually the whole opening of the eye, not just the actual eyeball, but it's really from corner of eyelid to corner of eyelid there. So you're probably used to that. And that's kind of also what I usually use as a bit of a way to help me estimate what is the distance between the two eyes here. So you start from here to there. You're like, yeah, we can more or less fit one eye from there, from here to there, and from there to here. So that's another way you can go about kind of measuring proportions, just using your own eyes. I'm not sure we can fit exactly the width of one eye between the two eyes here. If I measured it, maybe it would be the same, but it looks to me like maybe from here to there, this is about, I'd say this is about 90% from here to there. I could be wrong on that, but my own eye tells me that the distance from here to here is about 90%. I feel as if her two eyes are just slightly closer together than the average of the population. It's a good time to talk about camera field of view, because for the videos that I have posted so far on YouTube, you've probably seen in there that I haven't really changed the FOV of the camera within Blender, and I do know where the control for that is, of course. You simply have to go to View here within your interface to change the FOV here, but I haven't actually changed the FOV within Blender, and I have a tendency to sculpt using the 50mm default value for the focal length of the camera there. And some people have seen that and think that I'm actually just clueless, and that I don't know that you can actually change the field of view of the camera there, or the focal length of the camera there. But the reason why I have kept that 50mm value is because I just kind of really, really like it. And yes, when you are zoomed in to the character, like we are zoomed in here when we are working on right now, there is some perspective distortion that is introduced within the image, of course, because the field of view, or rather the focal length, is at the value at which it is. But the reason why I actually like to sculpt using this 50mm focal length here is because that focal length changes based on the distance of the camera to the model. When the camera pulls out, the perspective flattens because the whole head fits within a smaller field of view, of course. And that has the impact of flattening out the perspective. So the reason why I actually like that default value of 50mm is because it actually allows me to look at the face within a wide range of field of views, if you will, a wide range of focal lengths. And focal length is something that actually varies within picture to picture, right? If we take a look at this particular picture here, the focal length here is shorter in this particular picture than it is for, let's say, this particular picture. You can kind of tell that just the way that the perspective kind of looks over the face, it just looks as if the camera that was filming her at that moment is just a little bit closer to her face than it was when this was filmed. Now, it could be that it's the same lens. I'm not 100% sure. It could actually be. I mean, this looks like a very long lens, whereas this here looks like a lens that was a little bit shorter there. But there's really no denying that lens length is something that varies within movies, depending on the shot, depending on the movie. They will use a different lens. if we compare this particular close-up of her to, let's say, the one that is right next to it, right? So in both cases, we are actually looking at her face, of course, with the same sort of angle here. But you can clearly see that she looks like two totally different persons because the field of, or rather the focal length of the camera was not the same. In this particular case, the perspective is very squished. And so the skull starts to look very wide in relation to the front of the face. And there seems to be less distance between the eyes and the mouth. So you can see that she almost looks like a different person here versus this one here, where the camera was clearly much closer to her face there, and the focal length of the camera was lower. So there's more perspective distortion there. So that's why for me, it's not important to have one single value that we set our focal length to when it comes to sculpting. I think it's totally fine to increase the default focal length of 50 millimeters to something else if we want to do that. I think that's totally cool, especially if we're trying to match a particular reference that we have. But I don't find that my sculpts are necessarily better if I stick to only one focal length. And in fact, having a focal length that is slightly shorter in this particular case, especially since we're within Blender, makes it so that as we zoom out of the head, the perspective flattens, which in turn allows us to see our head at different focal lengths. So just pay attention as the camera zooms out at different moments. You can see how the perspective flattens. You can see kind of how far my screen is right now. And so for me, that 50 millimeters, it actually feels very natural when I'm looking at a head here. If I look at, let's say, this particular video afterward and I look at it as a little thumbnail, then there seems to be a lot of perspective distortion in there. But at the distance at which I am from my screen and how big my screen is, that 50 millimeters actually makes the face look very natural. And this would actually be something that would be actually very interesting to either test out or to experiment with at some point. Maybe this is something that I'll actually do at some point, which is to try and actually measure what is the distance from my face to my screen, how big the screen is in relation to my own field of view, and therefore how big, let's say, should or what should be the most optimal field of view values or focal length values to use within Blender so that I get the most natural perspective out of that. That's actually something that would be very interesting to test out. If one of you feels like trying that out, that would be something great to do. I think that could be a really nice project for someone to undertake. I'll probably try that myself at some point, and if I do, I'll make sure to let you know. But so that's why I use the default focal length here of 50 millimeters. And you'll still see me change that at some point. Sometimes I do want to match a particular reference, try to match the perspective distortion within a particular reference. I'll have a tendency to maybe change it in that particular context. It's just another one of those variables that we can play with to help us observe things better. Don't be afraid to play around with that. Which brings us back to that very topic that I've mentioned before, which is anthropometry, okay? Anthropometry is the science of measuring human proportions. And if you make sure by using the measurement tools within Blender that your head is properly scaled for a human being, that the width of the skull is what it needs to be, that the distance between the eyes is what it needs to be, that it all falls within a standard human range, then you don't have to worry about perspective distortion nearly as much, because no matter how distorted your own viewport is, because of perspective and focal length, you know that your proportions will always be good because you have measured them to make sure that they were accurate. When sculpting likenesses, I find that it's very important to try to understand what is the essence of someone's face. I hate fleeting definitions. In fact, I think that when we're not able to define something, it just means that we've failed at finding the right words to convey the meaning of something. But when it does come to the essence of a face, I'm not sure that there is necessarily something better that I can offer right now in terms of definition of what is the essence of a face than what it is that you feel when you look at someone, what it is that you feel makes them who they are. Because ultimately, I think that the essence of a face is one of the key components of a likeness, making them look like who they are, but that it can also be conveyed through a lot of different things, okay? Like you have people whose essence, what makes them look the way that they are, can be something as simple as the fact that they have a beauty mark somewhere on their face, they have a mole somewhere on their face, and having that mole at that particular location makes that person look exactly who they are. I'm thinking of Robert De Niro when I think of, let me just put this here on the side. When I think of moles over a face that really contribute to the essence of a face, I think of Robert De Niro. The essence of a face can also be things like proportions, can also be like a particular look. When you look at someone's eyes, there's a particular look in there somehow. Like you feel as if there's something distinctive about their eyes, about the shape of their eyelids, of their eyebrows. There's just something that catches your own eye that you're like, oh, this kind of looks a little bit atypical. This looks a little bit different than other people. And I feel as if this is, when I think of them, I think about that particular detail, So what is the essence of a face is something that is very, very different between face to face, but we always want to be trying to figure out, okay, what is it about a particular face that makes them look like who they are? Can I put into words a few of the more descriptive facial features of someone that really makes them look like who they are? And if we're able to do that, then it gives us really a very, very strong clue as to what we should be focusing on to properly capture the likeness of someone. And one thing that people don't actually think about often enough when they think of the essence of a face or really describing someone's face in a way that sets their face apart from pretty much anyone else's face. One thing that is a little, I think, underappreciated there is asymmetry. When we sculpt, and especially as I'm doing right now, I'm sculpting, as you can see, in a way that is symmetrical, because that is how my brush is set right now. And too often, asymmetry is something that is relegated to the later stages of creating a head, because we're kind of afraid of breaking symmetry, because if we do break symmetry, then it means that it's a little bit harder afterward to perhaps do major changes, if we want to do major changes on something. Because our mesh is asymmetrical, we kind of get a little bit afraid of the fact that we may have to do something twice on both sides of the face. And so we have a tendency to just push that notion of symmetry, or asymmetry rather. We have a tendency to put that aside and to kind of always think about faces in a symmetrical fashion. But I think that asymmetry, which we all have, by the way, is within our face, within our facial features, is often one of the most important factors, or one of the most important characteristics of someone's facial essence. There is a lot of personality that is conveyed through asymmetry. If we're not spending enough time to make sure that we're capturing the essence of someone's facial asymmetry, then we are missing out a key component of what makes them look like who they are. So in this particular case, if I was to describe Emily Blunt's essence, then we could try to do that. Of course, different people will have different answers to that. But if I try to describe it myself, I would actually start with that notion of asymmetry as one of the most important characteristics that makes her look like who she is. When we look at her face here, take a look at how she has one eye that looks like it's just slightly lazy, right? Like, in fact, it's like, almost looks like it's like maybe a millimeter, maybe 2 max, but maybe only 1. Let me actually bring this back. In fact, let me just pause this here for just a second. You can see how her eyes are not symmetrical. It feels like this eye here is just slightly, just like very, very slightly lower than this particular eye here. If we take a look at her lid here, seems to be slightly, once again, this is a question of like millimeters and perhaps even less than that, but her eyelid here seems to be drooping down. It's a little bit more lazy, if you will, than this particular eyelid here. There's a very, very, very subtle asymmetry within the shape of her eyes. If we take a look at the shape of the top lid, between the top lid and the eye crease, you can see that here it looks like it's slightly thicker than the one that is here, right? Part of this, like the fact that she has one eye that's just slightly lazy like that, it kind of feels like. Now, if we take a look at it here, we can also see that here is a key component of what makes Emily Blunt look like who she is. And I'm not sure that I'll be able to successfully capture this within the original sketch. This is a very subtle detail, although it is an extremely important one. It also, I'm not sure that I'll necessarily be able to really capture this before we are done here, but this is definitely something that I am keeping on the back of my mind and something that I want to take a look at once again within the future and make sure that I'm capturing once again. So this is something that is on the back of my mind and something that sooner or later I will want to start to integrate within this particular head here. So her eyes are slightly asymmetrical, and that is a very, very important component to her likeness. Another component to her likeness, and we really wouldn't be able to appreciate that too much here, okay, is the relationship between the width of her jaw and the width of her cheekbones. And this is actually easier to spot when we look at her from the back. So if we take a look at, let's say, this particular reference here, in fact, if we take a look at how much her cheekbones seem to be sticking out versus her jaw, like her jaw is actually very narrow in relation to how wide her cheekbones are. Once again, this isn't something that I'll properly capture on this first pass over the head, but this is something that I will make sure to capture better over the second pass on the head when we will be refining those volumes in a future video there. Her cheekbones are very wide and her jaw is, I don't want to say that her jaw is thin or narrower or perhaps narrower than most people, but there is definitely a high degree of contrast between how wide her cheekbones are in relation to how wide her jaw is. And so that for me is yet another key characteristic of what makes her face look like who she is. And then of course there are the things that are a little bit more obvious to us about her face that really makes Emily Blunt look like who she is, like the fact that she's got a double chin there. If we wanted to add one on top of that, we could look into the shape of her eyebrows because they're not the same. This one has a slightly kind of curvier shape than this one here. You can see this one is slightly flat here, whereas this one seems to have a bit of a curve there. So the asymmetry there, once again, within the eyebrows, we could add that as a number 4, perhaps, in terms of the sort of anatomical details that we can spot. And in fact, I would actually offer a 5th one. So 5 key points to her likeness. And for me, the 5th one would actually be the shape of her glabella. And I just find that this zone here, there's a very beautiful kind of, it's not quite 90 degrees here, but just this particular zone, for some reason, it just looks very distinctive to me. There's just something here about particular angles here, how nice and geometric this particular zone here, that just makes her look really like her, you know, which I just don't clearly have the words for it, but I just can kind of look at her face and feel like, yeah, there's something there that looks a little bit different than what I'm used to seeing, you know. If we can capture a few of those, let's say a minimum of 3 points like these, 3 likeness points or 3 essence points about someone's face, and then we try to capture those as well as we can, there's a very, very, very high chance we'll be able to create a very successful likeness. So you can see that I'm at a point here where I am refining a lot of those volumes. When we have started to sculpt this particular head, we were in a very rough state. I mentioned that I really didn't want to polish the surface at the beginning or to have a smooth surface because it would influence too much the how I was reading the volumes, and I would rather work with a very rough surface to begin with. But there is definitely a point where we do want to start to polish those details there. We do want to polish the surface a little bit. And you can see that I'm never polishing it to the point that I'm losing all trace of the sculpting that I have done. You can see that there is always a little bit of of an organic texture that is kind of left over there. So I'm not using the smooth brush in this particular case. I'm really just using the fill brush and the fill carve brush, as you can see here, the particular brush that is selected there. Because if I do over smooth it, then two things happen. One is that it starts to look a little bit artificial for me, first of all. But second of all, it also makes it harder for me to do more work on top of it afterward. Because of what I have mentioned previously, like a surface that is just very, very smooth, I just find that I just become very, you can see here, I'm trying to work in there a little bit what we were actually talking about here at this particular point, about her likeness there. If the surface is just too smooth, I just start to hesitate too much for some reason at putting down some clay brushstrokes, you know. I find that the surface is something that becomes a little bit too precious. I want to preserve. The surface is a little bit too smooth, and I do a few brushstrokes. Those brushstrokes will really highly contrast with the rest of the surface around it, and usually it makes it harder for me to be satisfied about the changes I could be doing to the volumes there. So keeping a little bit of that sketchiness over the surface, for me, it just helps to make sure that as I am refining those volumes further, that whatever it is that I am doing is a little bit more harmonious. But definitely there is a point here where we want to, after we were very, very happy with the volumes in general, we feel as if we've done a pretty good pass over the secondary details. We feel as if this is starting to be in a pretty good spot. We definitely want to polish the surface, because then the different planes of the face, the different volumes, we'll just be able to read them better like that. And it's going to start to give us a little bit more of an appreciation for what the final product could be. But it doesn't mean that the sculpting is done, that we won't want to continue to refine and use our clay brush and change those volumes later. Doesn't mean that. It just means that we are polishing the surface to help us at this particular stage read the volumes a little bit better. When we look at the reference, you can see that the top lids, they just look like they're a lot narrower than what I currently have. This is a key point that I'll want to focus on when I am doing my second pass over this head, because we are at the sketching stage right now, okay? We do want to just try to get our likeness to be as close as it can. At this particular stage, if we try to get ourselves up to like 100% there, we're going, like, it's going to slow us down terribly. We're going to get lost within the wilderness of details, and we just won't really be able to work in an effective way. We want to be able to capture the likeness first to about 80%, make sure that everything is where it needs to be, and we can leave for later the more pedantic polishing and worrying about getting everything to be 100% there. So those lids, I'll want to shorten them later on, and I'll definitely want to work in there that asymmetry that we have talked about. But in the context of just trying to get the likeness down close while trying to be somewhat effective in terms of time, those lids are as close as they really need to be at this particular state. They're not perfect. They need to be addressed. They need to be shortened. But they're close enough for now that they fall within what I consider to be that 80% value. But so yeah, this is the sketching phase. So at this phase, we want to worry about getting the major volumes down, the major details down. The next pass that we will do afterward, and I will also record a class on that, will be what I consider to be the second pass over the head. And it's great if you can even give it a few days between the first pass, which is what this is, and what will be the second pass, to just let your mind rest a little bit, let your eyes rest a little bit, and come back with fresh eyes to look at your head for the next pass there. Over those few days of a break that we take between the first pass and the second pass, you'll probably look at your head once in a while during that time, and things that you were satisfied of when you were doing the first pass will probably start to bother you. Either distances, proportions, whatever it is. You'll start to spot things that you're like, oh, this definitely isn't there yet. Your second pass is really just a moment where you want to be addressing all of those. You want to be going back on top of your head, and you want to be addressing every little observation that you had of your work and every little deviation that you were able to spot there, things will start to bother you after you're done with the first pass. In that time between the first pass and the second pass, some things will start to bother you. Some proportions won't be quite there. Some of those secondary anatomical shapes will start to be a little bit too strong, a little bit too soft. You'll want to change them a little bit. Some of your planes, you'll find that they're not exactly how they should be in terms of placement, shape, whatever it is. So the second pass is really just a refinement pass, where we want to go in there and we want to address all of those little things that are that have bothered us after we had completed the first pass. So it's the refinement pass. It's not enough to do a second pass, because the thing about likenesses is that the closer we get to a likeness, the more precise we have to be, the more time we have to spend to make sure that we are getting everything down exactly there. So the second pass is not to get to 100%, if you will, but the second pass will be to go from, let's say, 80% up to 90%, perhaps. It may take us a few hours to go from 0 to 80%, and it's going to take us as much time to go from 80% to 90% in terms of capturing the likeness. And after that, it'll probably take as much time for every extra percentage increase that we may want to throw on top of that afterward. If we want to get to 98% of the likeness, you can expect those last few percentage points to take you a multiple of the amount of time that it will have taken you just to get to that stage. It's like when you level a character within a role-playing video game. The last levels take much, much longer to get and to reach than the levels at the start. 2 passes won't be enough, but the goal of the second pass is to bring in a lot of new references that perhaps we haven't used before, and to really start to really analyze and really compare very carefully our 3D model with our references. And we'll talk about that once we get there. I will also have some content as far as that is concerned that I will make sure that you have access to. In fact, spoilers, I have already completed the second pass on this head by the time I'm recording this particular voiceover. But after that second pass, we'll also have things like a third pass, perhaps even a fourth pass, when we start to really, really delve really deep within each and individual facial feature of the face and really analyze them, compare them, and try to get them as close as possible. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Our goal for this first pass is to reach 80%. For the eyes, you can see that I've just gone ahead and have sculpted the 2 irises independently, and I have just pushed in there the pupil. The reason why I have sculpted those 2 asymmetrically is simply because I wanted to add that little kind of fake highlight there, and I wanted to do that asymmetrically as well. There's not much of a reason why I have sculpted the 2 eyes asymmetrically beyond that. You can make them symmetrically, it's fine. It's really not a problem. But I guess it's just a habit that I have. And usually at this stage, as you can see, I've turned off symmetry and I'm just starting to sculpt some of those major wrinkles of the face in an asymmetrical way. I am sketching those out the same way that I have sketched out everything else, which is I'm just using the clay strips brush. I'm using a polish brush. I keep using the term polish because it comes from ZBrush, but really my polish brush in this particular case is the fill brush. And there too, I could use things like the draw sharp brush or other very, very sharp brushes to try and define those wrinkles. But I like there too, just like for everything else, to use the clay strips here, because once again, I want to have that organic finish to the surface. If you look within those wrinkles there, between those little skin folds, you can see that it's not a clean, sharp, straight line. It is a little bit ragged. It's a little bit rough, in fact. And if you look at wrinkles from really, really close, if you have really high-res references, or if you look at your own face, if you have some, you'll see that they too aren't these very nice, clean, surgical lines, but rather they have a little bit of a rough finish to them. They're not always completely straight. And I can capture that by, once again, here, just building up those little skin folds using the clay strips brush. And then after, we're just polishing the top of the skin folds so that I do get rid of a lot of those little imperfections that are there. And I'm just keeping just the right amount of imperfections on the surface so that the surface looks organic. Same thing for the lips here. It's very tempting to keep a little bit of those of that rough finish on the lips here. And especially since some of my brush strokes were going in the same direction as some of the kind of wrinkles that we're used to seeing on lips there. It just makes those look like they're well-fitting naturally. But of course, you know, later on, once we get a future stage on this head, we'll obviously want to get out of remesh. We'll want to have proper lips, a proper mouth bag in there, and we'll start to really worry a lot more about trying to really capture those very fine wrinkles we may want to have over lips there. Well, we will do that later, but for now, those few brush strokes that are there just look like a good approximation of lip details. When we are working on things like nostrils and the tip of a nose, it's very legit to use a lot of smooth brush because those are highly curvy surfaces. And if there are one thing that clay brushes aren't really good at, it is to create very round volumes. So using a smooth brush in those instances is definitely very legit. I've been fighting with those wrinkles. In the end, I've decided to get rid of those completely, although that won't be within this particular sculpt. But I was kind of looking at some of the references and I was kind of thinking, okay, what kind of expression do I want to give her eventually in this particular pose that I'll be working on? Perhaps giving her a little bit of a compression here, as we can see in this particular reference here. A little bit of compression there. I was more getting the feeling when looking at the final head that she was a little bit more, she looked worried as opposed to have that kind of stoic look to her. I've kind of more or less decided ultimately to get rid of them for now. I'll probably bring them back later. But for now, I feel as if the head is better off if I get rid of those. So we've been working from bigger details all the way down to the smaller details, and now we are worrying about the finish that we are giving to the surface in this particular case. It's probably not worth for you to spend more than a few hours blocking out your first pass, your sketch of a head, or definitely after a few hours, definitely take a break and put the head aside. It's not worth for you to work for more time than that because you'll just get fatigued and you won't be able to read as well what you are doing, the kind of surface that you are looking at. You won't be able to read it as well. So do take a break after you've worked on something for a few hours, put it aside, come back to it on the next day. If we define the first pass over our head as completing the head sketch, getting our head to 80%, it's okay if it takes you more than one day to do that. But definitely give yourself a break after you've been working on something for a few hours. Put it aside, come back on it the next day. You'll be a lot more refreshed. You'll be able to appreciate a lot more the volumes and the likeness that you are working on. So that's our first pass on the head. Once we have completed our first pass, then we want to move on to the second pass, where we have said that we would take it from 80% there to about 90% there. And I will post that within a future class here on the website. So do keep an eye out for the future classes coming to Algang, because I will be posting my process for the second pass on this as well. So that's our class. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.